Okay, so we have 3 large canvases, all pre-painted, and basically these are 24 by 36. Normally, you'd be able to put these on 2 24 by 36 canvases. However, we're going to stretch this and make this into a triptych. So what I'm going to do is the canvas in the center is going to get all 4 of these grids applied to it. And then I'm going to apply these to the outer 3 outer canvases, okay? But these won't come to the far edge on the right. They'll actually be hugging the left side of the canvas. Because the art was finished off on the edges, I can actually apply this on the middle of the canvas without it looking strange. It doesn't have to have a straight edge, and that was the clever design function of these inlays. So we're gonna go ahead and apply those, and I'll record snippets of it so you can see how I did that. Go ahead and cut up all of your pieces and lay them down. And now you're going to go ahead and apply your fairly thick layer of paint. You want to make sure that the paint stays wet so that your ink that's on the carrier paper is transferred down into the wet paint. If you notice that your paint is drying out, you can give it a little spritz of water just to kind of get it all nice and fresh. Lay down the paper face down into the wet paint and smooth it down with your hand. Gently spritz it with the water and then go back in with a wet sponge or wet cloth and kind of tap up and down. Try as hard as you can to not go back and forth because you can accidentally make the ink under the underside of the carrier paper bleed a little bit. So a lot of tapping is best for this. And then you're just going to repeat that for all of these lower panels on the canvases. I went ahead and I did that with the 2 center grids, and then I'm going to apply that to the 2 outer grids as well. You'll notice I am not applying any of the images on top of these base grids. I want to do them separately. And the reason I did that is because for whatever reason, I can never seem to line them up properly. So you just kind of have to find a way to make it work for yourself. And this is the best way for me. So I always put the bottom ones down first, and then I seal them. And then I go ahead and add in the top layer so that everything kind of stays in place without any excess bleeding. It just works out better for me that way. Now you're going to come in after everything is dry and you're going to spritz it again with water. Make sure you get the edges from edge to edge with moisture so that everything comes up nice and neat. Start in one corner and kind of just gradually pull up, and nice and clean. You should have your image application really smooth. I would totally suggest laying these down flat on something. We have a really large island in the kitchen, so I just kind of lay them all down there to dry, and I could totally use them again. So I'm going to go ahead and do that to all of these lower panels, and then we're going to go ahead and get started on the second half of the canvas. I did want to quickly note that you're going to see wrinkling in some of the carrier paper. I think that the etching actually gives you a lot of flexibility, so you don't really notice any of the wrinkling from side to side because all of the etched drawings are literally side to side ink and they just sort of blend in. So if you're a little nervous about any of the wrinkles, I wouldn't worry about it. It's just going to kind of lend itself to being old. Once your inlay is dry, you can go ahead and spray it. I'm using a product called Spectrafix, and basically it's a spray fixative that you can spray indoors. If you're going to do a great deal of layering on top of this and you want a super protected layer and you're okay with spraying outside, you can use something like Krylon or Grumbacher spray fixative. They're just really stinky, so the Spectrafix is really great indoors. Once it's dry, I can go ahead and start adding all those second grid layers. And I sealed that bottom layer so I don't accidentally reactivate those as I'm applying the layers on top. It just works for me, just in case you're a little bit of a messy crafter like I am. So you'll notice as I spray the seam together, I kind of tickle the actual seam in between just to kind of make sure that those edges are touching as much as possible. So try not to blend back and forth, as I mentioned before, just a lot of little tippy tappies with your finger, and it sort of helps to get those two edges nice and connected. So I know right off the bat that I accidentally had too much of a seam between these two pieces, and I'm just gonna go ahead and fix that a little bit later on. So this is a good opportunity for you guys to see how I fix boo-boos like that. Once all of your layers are dry, you can go ahead and spray and gently peel up all of your carrier paper. Be super careful that you don't accidentally smear these. These have not been sealed. All right, so you're going to sometimes have a seam, and this seam carried over into this area here. You could barely see it in the house, but what happens is you basically just need to wet the paint inlay. So I'm spritzing a little bit of water on a paper plate, and I'm just dipping my brush in water, and I'm gonna come in and start kind of agitating the edge of this to get it to kind of soften and bleed down a little bit. Now keep in mind, I sprayed the first grid. Okay, so with that said, the one below it's not going to reactivate quite as easily as this top layer is. And I'm just kind of going back and forth, left to right, and kind of waking that ink up a little bit. So basically, and I'm just laying this down because it's hard to hold it up. I'm going to intentionally blur above and below to kind of marry those two seams together a little bit more. And I'm also going to come in and add in some white gesso. I'm going to be adding Venetian plaster to the sides of this to give a bit more texture and add some cool patinas to it. So I've got opportunity here. Now you can kind of take charcoals, and this is called Cretacolor. Cretacolor. And I like using the dark brown sepia colored charcoal. So I'm gonna come in and kind of intentionally scribble in here. I think the less deliberate you are, the better. I'm just scribbling like I would if I was a little kid coloring in. And I'm gonna come around on some of my edges of my trees in areas that came out really perfect, that are so perfect that I don't need to worry about like fixing anything. But what it's gonna do is it's gonna give me an opportunity to make this more cohesive by having some of this smudge in other areas, and then it just sort of looks like somebody's old charcoal sketch or etching. Okay, so again, just kind of doing really irregular little doodles. And when I'm painting, I very often will do like little branches and little leaves and whatnot that kind of drift off the side. So now I can come in, you could use your finger, you could use a paintbrush, whichever you prefer. and you can take some gesso and kind of intentionally smudge this, this becomes way more painterly. And again, this is like a great opportunity to sort of tweak and make areas imperfect so that your imperfect areas are easy enough to kind of disguise, hide, whatever you want to call it. So just by adding a little of this white gesso in over my charcoal, I'm able to kind of fix up some of these seams, but I've got to make sure that I introduce it in other areas so that it's not like, oh wow, she did that right in the seam. Okay, so the last step is to add a little bit of texture, and I'm coming in with just a little bit of Venetian Plaster applied with the silicone blade from IOD. The small one would be fine too, it's just that I'm working on such a large scale here that it's easier to kind of work. And normally, like when you're applying plaster, you're using a trowel. So I'm kind of wanting to get some of those hard, straight edges, but I also don't want them all to be super consistent. I want them to have irregularity. And that will make a little bit more sense once we're done kind of drying the plaster up, because I'm going to come back in with a little bit of an aged patina, a liquid patina, and it's going to kind of sit in the grooves of my plaster. And there is a point where you need to stop and step away. And for me, that's right now. Okay, so we're gonna let that dry up, and then we'll go ahead and start adding in some patina over our textured areas. Okay, so I'm gonna use Amy Howard's Antiquing Glaze. And because I used a matte type of paint surface, this is going to absorb a little bit better, but it's going to absorb even better in the Venetian plaster. So what I do is I soak a sea sponge, squeeze out all of the water, and then basically I'm going to come in and start kind of blotting. I'm going to kind of work my way in a little bit in the areas where I have plaster. Keep in mind, I have not yet sealed any of these areas in the top. I did seal the bottom panels, but not the top section. So the objective here is to kind of blot in the areas that can potentially smear, but I'm also trying to make the entire thing feel cohesive and aged. You can kind of come in, and I'm a little bit running low on that, so I'll add a little bit more here. The color is basically the color of like tea. So it's not super dark. You can't expect to get like crazy, crazy dark antiquing. This is really supposed to look like something has legitimately aged for a number of years. It's been like hit by sun, you know, it's old. So I'm just blotting and trying to make this whole thing feel cohesive. As you can see, I threw down a few splatters because I really, really like splatter in all of its forms. And I'm gonna try to hit this basically anywhere I have plaster for sure. Okay, but it's okay to leave areas untouched as well. can see all the lovely areas where they are kind of still white, but that tea-like stain is absolutely perfect. It's just basically an antiquing glaze. So we're gonna go ahead and let that guy dry completely, and then I can go ahead and seal. If I wanted to add more patina, I could, but make sure you do any and all of your patina before you seal it. That way it's just kind of all done. So I did decide to add just a little bit of gray. It's kind of a doctored gray, but it's really warm. So you can kind of see it's a really warm gray. It's not cool. But I just wanted to add a little bit slightly darker age spots. In the areas where you have like the plaster marks, they're particularly nice, you know, because they kind of sit in those spots and within that texture and makes it really, really interesting. Don't do too much of it though. You know, this should be like, kind of like your last, I'm sort of tapping off some of that brown antiquing and introducing a little of this gray. Consider it like a peekaboo. See, that was a lot. But that's one of the really cool things about this, is that when you apply it with a sea sponge, you can soak it back up. And I'll just go back over that area again. That's okay. But look how yummy that is kind of sitting in here. And really does look old. Splatter, you can. If you guys have been watching me long enough, you know that I'm pretty organic in my style. I like things to just flow and be very loose and relaxed. I don't want anything too neat. All right, that's good. Definitely just the right amount of warmth to the piece. And I'm gonna go ahead and let this dry, and I'm gonna seal it up. Best way to seal something like this is with your spray-on fixative. I think I would probably do one coat of something like an aerosol Krylon or Grumbacher spray fixative. Or if you're doing the Spectrafix, which is the pump sprayer, do at least 2 coats, allowing it to dry in between each of its coats. And then if you want to do a top coat after your fixative has dried, you can totally do that. I am going to do that because I want a fully matte finish. I don't want to see any of the lines from my original carrier paper areas, from any of my plaster. I want them to all have the same shimmer / like matte effect across the entire canvas. So I'll go ahead and seal these up and hang them for you.